Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always up for a good legal puzzle.
This time, we're heading to India to look at how the courts are grappling with the idea of marriage, at least when it comes to legal rights and protections.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area full of gray areas.
Especially in a place like India where you have ancient traditions bumping up against modern life, right?
Exactly.
And our starting point is this case. Chanmuniya v. Virendra Kumar Singh Kushwaha. Back in 2011.
Oh, I remember reading about that one.
It really sparked a debate. Chanmuniya was asking the courts for financial support from a man she considered her husband. They'd lived together for years.
Right.
And their community saw them as married. But they never had that formal Hindu marriage ceremony.
So the question was, did their relationship qualify as a marriage under the law?
You got it. And the High Court initially said, nope, no legal marriage here because it didn't strictly fit the Hindu Marriage Act.
That's where things get tricky, because so much of life doesn't fit neatly into legal boxes.
I know, right?
Yeah.
So this case basically asks, can you be considered married just by living together and being known as a couple?
It goes even deeper than that. It makes you think about how the law adapts to changing social norms, especially in places like India undergoing such rapid change.
That's what makes this deep dive so interesting, to see how those norms get reflected or don't get reflected in legal decisions.
It's like holding up a mirror to society.
And to really get into it, we got to go way back to British common law in the 1800s.
The roots of so much of Indian law. You can trace a direct line from those old British cases to what's happening in India's courts today.
It's pretty amazing how connected everything is when you look at it.
Right. Like, take those landmark cases, Lucia Adelaide Piers, Lieutenant C.W. Campbell, the Breadalbane case.
I gotta admit, some of these case names, they're a mouthful.
I know, right? But they established this key idea, marriage by cohabitation and repute.
So, like, if you're living together and everyone sees you as married...
That's the repute part.
Yeah, the social aspect of it.
That could actually be enough to make it a legal marriage.
Even back then?
Even back then. And this idea really shifted the burden of proof.
Meaning?
If someone wanted to challenge your marriage, they'd have to prove it wasn't legit.
Rather than you having to prove it was.
Yeah. It was kind of groundbreaking, really.
Especially for the time period.
Oh, for sure. And that Breadalbane case, it's fascinating because it involved a relationship that,
Let me guess, it wasn't your typical love story.
You could say that. It started as an adulterous relationship.
Whoa!
But over time, it became this recognized marriage because they lived as husband and wife, and society accepted them as such.
It really shows how social context matters in legal matters.
It's not just about black and white rules on paper.
So much gray area, huh?
Life is full of it.
So how did all this British precedent shape Indian law? Did they just adopt it wholesale?
Well, India, being under British rule, naturally inherited a lot of those legal principles.
Yeah.
And we see that in some key Indian cases, too. Dinohami in 27, Mahaba Ali Khan in 29.
These case names, they all start to run together after a while.
Tell me about it.
But the point is...
These cases, they ran with that same idea, presumption of marriage, even without a ton of paperwork.
So Indian courts were like, hey, if you're living like a married couple, we're going to assume you are, unless someone proves otherwise.
You got it. That focus on social realities also shows up in the Criminal Procedure Code, or CrPC, especially Section 125.
The one meant to prevent people from ending up destitute, right?
Yep, to provide basic support for those in need.
And here's a fun fact. Initially, Section 125 wasn't just about wives. It was broader, addressing homelessness in general.
Oh, that's interesting.
Shows how its roots were in social welfare.
Makes you think about the intentions behind the law.
Then comes the famous Shah Bano Begum case in 85. Supreme Court says, Section 125, that's a secular safeguard.
Meaning?
It applied to everyone, no matter their religion.
So regardless of what your personal religious laws might say.
Exactly. It became a crucial tool, especially for women who might not have that legal marriage certificate, but needed help.
Powerful stuff. So we see this theme emerging social context, how a couple is perceived, it matters in the eyes of the law.
Right. It's not just about checking off legal boxes.
It's about acknowledging real-life situations and relationships.
Which is what makes this whole deep dive so intriguing.
It is, isn't it?
The law trying to keep up with the messiness of human relationships, that's a story worth exploring.
Well, absolutely. It makes you think about how the law defines family and who deserves protection.
And that's a conversation that's happening all over the world.
Absolutely.
So are you ready to keep digging into this case?
Let's do it. I'm curious to see where this rabbit hole leads.
Me too. So much more to uncover. So it seems like India was really trying to create laws that helped people, in tough situations.
Yeah, trying to find that balance between strict legal rules and
actual lived experiences.
Right.
But like with anything legal, I'm sure it wasn't always smooth sailing.
Oh, definitely not. You start seeing differing opinions in the courts, especially when it came to Section 125 and that whole question of who qualifies as a wife.
Because that determines who gets that financial support, right?
Exactly. Some judges, they insisted on seeing that legal marriage certificate.
Even if a couple had been living together for ages and were known as husband and wife in their community.
Yeah, which kind of clashes with the whole point of preventing hardship, doesn't it?
Totally. It's like you're trying to help people in need, but then you create these roadblocks.
Right. And you see this in the Yamuna Bai case in 88. Very strict interpretation.
It's funny, when I was reading about that case, I kept thinking about what was happening in the U.S. around the same time.
Oh, like what?
Well, remember that Marvin v. Marvin case in California?
Palimony case.
Yeah, where they said, hey, even if you're not legally married, you can still have financial rights based on the relationship. So
like if you lived together and contributed to each other's lives, the courts recognized that...
Exactly. It was all about implied contracts. You're basically agreeing to support each other even without that formal marriage.
Interesting. So did India adopt that palimony idea?
Not directly, but it shows how legal systems all over the world were grappling with these new kinds of relationships.
And how to protect people in those relationships.
Right. Like, just sticking to that narrow definition of wife might not be fair or helpful in every situation.
For sure. And that brings us to a really important development in Indian law, the Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act of 2005.
This is a big deal, right?
Huge. It completely changed the game because for the first time, it acknowledged live-in relationships
as worthy of legal protection.
Yep. It broadened the whole definition of domestic relationship.
So even couples who weren't officially married could get help if they were facing abuse.
Exactly. And it meant that women in these relationships could ask for financial support.
Even without that marriage certificate.
Right. Because the law finally recognized that violence and abuse can happen in all sorts of relationships, not just within marriage.
It's like the law finally caught up with reality, In
a way, yeah. It acknowledged that families and relationships come in many forms.
And that protection shouldn't be limited to a certain type of relationship.
Exactly. And this brings us full circle back to Chanmuniya and her fight for recognition.
What struck me about that case was how the Supreme Court seemed to get it. Like, they understood that times are changing, and maybe the old interpretation of wife needed a fresh look.
It's like they were saying, hold on, maybe our laws need to catch up with how people are actually living their lives.
Right. And instead of just ruling one way or the other, they decided to punt it to a larger bench.
Which is not uncommon for complex cases.
They basically said, hey, larger bench, can you guys figure out how these three big issues affect a woman's right to maintenance under Section 125?
Yeah, those three questions are at the heart of the whole debate.
Okay, so break them down for me. What were they grappling with?
Well, the first one was about live-in relationships. How long does a couple have to live together before it's considered a marriage in the eyes of the law? What else do you need to prove?
And that's a big one. Because how do you even define living together?
Right. It's not just about sharing an address. Did they present themselves as a married couple to their community? Did they share finances, raise children together, make big decisions as partners? All that stuff matters.
It gets complicated fast.
Oh, yeah. And then you have that second question, the one about customary marriages.
Ah, right. India has so many different cultures and traditions.
And often, marriages happen according to those customs, not necessarily under the Hindu Marriage Act or some other specific law.
So even if you're married according to your community's customs, you might not be legally married when it comes to certain rights.
Unfortunately, that's the situation some people find themselves in.
It's like you're married in one sense, but not in another.
And that can create all sorts of problems, especially when you're talking about financial support or inheritance or things like that.
Right. So the court was basically asking, do we stick to the letter of the law, or do we acknowledge these different ways of forming families?
It's a tough question. Trying to balance legal consistency with the realities of a diverse society.
No easy answers there.
Nope. And then there's that third question, the one about how the Domestic Violence Act impacts Section 125.
Right, because the Domestic Violence Act uses a broader definition of relationship. Right.
Exactly. So the court was basically wondering if that new, more inclusive definition should also apply when it comes to maintenance claims.
So, like, if the Domestic Violence Act recognizes you as a partner for protection, shouldn't you also be recognized as a partner for financial support?
That's the logic they were exploring. It's about consistency in the law, really.
It would be kind of unfair to offer protection in one area, but not the other when it's the same relationship at the heart of it, right?
That's the argument, yeah. And that's what makes the Chanmuniya case so important. It could potentially lead to a major shift in how India handles all these relationships that fall outside that traditional marriage box.
It's like a legal earthquake waiting to happen, huh?
It could be. And its impact goes way beyond just legal stuff. It touches on ideas of family, social change, how we define relationships in the 21st century.
So much more than meets the eye, right?
Absolutely. The Chanmuniya case is just the tip of the iceberg.
Okay, so we've gone from historical precedents to these complex questions facing modern India. Before we wrap up this deep dive, though, I'd love to get your expert take on what we might see in the future. How do you think this will all play out?
Well, predicting the future of legal decisions, it's always a gamble. But I think it's safe to say that those 3 questions that the Supreme Court posed, those are going to have a big impact on how similar cases are handled moving forward.
So let's put on our legal prognosticator hats for a minute.
Okay.
What are some of the possible outcomes that you think are most likely?
Well, one possibility is that the larger bench, they stick with the existing precedent and they emphasize that you absolutely need to have solid legal proof of a marriage.
To claim maintenance under Section 125.
So like a clear line in the sand, married or not married.
Right. Which, it offers clarity, but it could also leave some women in a tough spot.
Especially those who are in long-term relationships that are recognized by their community, but haven't gone through that formal legal registration process.
Exactly. It would be a win for those who want, clear-cut legal definitions. But it might not be so fair for everyone.
Right. It's like you're prioritizing one value over another.
Exactly. Now, another scenario is that the bench takes a more nuanced approach.
Okay.
And they start looking at, how long the couple lived together, their reputation in the community, whether they really intended to be married, those kinds of things.
So more flexibility to look at the specifics of each case.
Right. Which allows for more, individualized justice, but it could also lead to some inconsistencies.
Because then you're relying more on the judge's interpretation.
Yeah. And different judges might see things differently. That age-old tension between clear rules and judicial discretion.
It's a tough one. And then there's the third possibility.
Which is?
That the bench decides to interpret Section 125 through the lens of the Domestic Violence Act.
Interesting.
Basically saying, hey, if the Domestic Violence Act uses this broader definition of domestic relationship, shouldn't we apply that same thinking to who qualifies as a wife when we're talking about maintenance?
So basically expanding the scope of Section 125.
Yeah, which would be a pretty big shift.
I bet that would be welcomed by a lot of people who are pushing for greater recognition of cohabiting couples.
For sure. It's more inclusive.
But I imagine there would be pushback, too.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Some people would see it as undermining the institution of marriage, or maybe creating too much legal ambiguity.
It's like every legal decision have these ripple effects.
It always does. But no matter what the larger bench decides the Chanmuniya case, it's part of a much bigger conversation that's happening in India and around the world.
About how the law keeps up with a changing society.
Exactly. It's about balancing tradition and progress.
Finding ways to ensure that everyone's rights are protected no matter their relationship status.
It's a complex puzzle with no easy answers.
It really is. It makes you think about, what is family in the 21st century?
Right. How do you define it? And who gets to decide?
So for our listeners out there, as we wrap up this deep dive, I think the big question to ponder is this. If the law starts recognizing relationships beyond just formal marriage, what impact might that have on things like, individual rights and responsibilities, family structures, social welfare policies? It's a lot to think about.
It is. It raises so many questions.
It's a reminder that we're all part of this ongoing conversation.
Right. It's not just something that happens in courtrooms.
Our choices, our beliefs, they all contribute to shaping the social and legal landscape.
Absolutely. So stay curious, stay engaged, keep those questions in mind.
Because these conversations, they matter.
They do. And they're only going to become more important as our world keeps changing.
Well said. Until next time, everyone, keep diving deep.